What's going on, everybody? This is Alex, a doctoral candidate at NUS Business School in Singapore, and I welcome you to another episode of the Foresight Chats. As you have seen, I have upgraded the design of the series, and I thought I would seize this opportunity to tell you a bit more about what this series is really about, which I actually haven't done yet. So this series really came about spontaneously as I started to have conversations with leading figures in the field of futures and foresight, and I thought those conversations might actually be of interest to the field at large, not just to me and the person I was talking to. And that is because in this series, I really try to ask difficult, sometimes ignored, sometimes even not so politically correct questions about the field and about the future in general, encouraging critical discussions that perhaps have not been heard of. You will also notice that the series has a distinct academic cut, and that is perhaps due to my background and affiliation with academia. Now, that doesn't mean that we're gonna be talking only about futures and foresight in universities, but it surely means that a lot of what we're gonna be talking about in this series revolves around teaching and researching the futures. So, that being said, let me introduce you to the guest I'm speaking to today in this episode, Andy Hines. Andy is Associate Professor and Program Coordinator for the University of Houston's graduate program in Foresight, and a speaker, workshop facilitator, and consultant through his firm Hinesight. Andy has 30 years of professional futurist experience with companies including Kellogg Company and Dow Chemical, and consulted with several other firms such as Coates and Jarrett and Innovero. Andy has written numerous books on future studies and foresight, including The Knowledge Base of Future Studies 2020, Thinking About the Future, Teaching About the Future, and Consumer Shift. I first met Andy in person in 2019 when I was in Houston at the Department of Technology Foresight to work on a research project as a visiting scholar. And I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to talk to him again today. You will notice that in this episode, we touch upon many sensitive and pedagogically related themes, which really reflects the scope of this series, such as the division between pragmatic and civilizational foresight, the corporate-driven approach of the Houston program, whether there is such a thing as left-wing and right-wing futures and foresight, and the Houston's team research on the state of foresight in North America. Lastly, I do want to apologize for the quality of the audio in this episode. I was experimenting with a new microphone which unfortunately didn't work well, so my sound isn't too clear. But the important thing is that Andy's sound is loud and clear, and I decided to pause this conversation anyway because the content of it is really exciting. So I promise to be more careful with the sound in the future, and I really hope that you will enjoy this conversation. Hi, Andy. Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure.
So, Andy, I was there in Houston last year, and it was quite an experience because, as you know, I came from the TANCAM program, and Houston is a much more pragmatic experience. When I was there, I was positively surprised that whenever we were talking about futures and foresight, you always paid a lot of attention to what is the customers, what is the client, what does the client want, right? So I found that pragmatic approach rather refreshing, and especially given the increase of interest in corporations for foresight practices, I found that quite interesting and not nonsense. So my first question is, the Houston program is one of the top programs in futures and foresight globally. How did this pragmatic approach come about? Was it there from the very beginning, or did it come about along the years, given your experience?
Yeah, no, actually, that's a great question. It started out in 1974, very much sort of a product of the flower child, Woodstock, let's look at the future because it's cool kind of ethos of experimental programs in the late 60s and early 70s. Oh, years later, they said, yeah, well, this is cool, but I'm not sure this is cutting it. So they did a program review and said, yeah, we should make it more of a professional, preparation for professional work. And that started the journey that, I came into the picture full time about 6 years ago and part time about 10 or 15 years ago. And having gone through the program myself, I became a pretty strong, very strong proponent for even more practical. So I've kind of driven it even further down to that end of the spectrum. And but that said, I do think I like the fact that there's a variety of approaches to how programs do it. I don't think everyone should be, maniacally professionally focused. It's good that we have some that are more theoretical, some that are more this, so I think that's, we are who we are, but we're glad that there are others.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is the distinctive feature. I also don't mean to throw shit on the TAMCAM program. In fact, I had a lot of fun there, and that's where I actually started. So absolutely, and perhaps that also caters to different demands, right? Some people just want to go into academia, and some people just want to do consulting. So it's okay. But how about the demand? Did you actually see a demand for that kind of cut? Did you actually see the need in the students asking for the applicable side of Foresight?
Well, yeah, I guess I'll use my own experience there is what motivated me, and I think it does reflect maybe a little bit what's going on in the field. So I first after I graduated from the program, I spent about 7 years with Coates and Jarrett, which is a consultancy up in Washington D.C. We produced these what I would call just spectacular analysis reports. But almost the universal feedback we'd get was that was really cool, but we're not really sure what to do with it. And
Right.
after you hear that again and again and again, it's like,
Oh, yeah.
what is going on here? Like what so
Are we in the real world?
Yeah, well, it prompted me to say, all right, I want to go inside, and that's why. So I did my Kellogg's and my Dow internal futurist gigs as a direct result to say, why is it so hard to implement this stuff? And I really learned a ton about that, and so it, there was, if you will, there was this market need that says unless we get more relevant, no one's gonna knock on the door if we can't help them, if we can't solve this problem of how do we make it more actionable and useful. Eventually, I think people just stopped asking, right? So I think there was and this was in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I think in the field as a whole started to get more actionable and useful, not just interesting thought pieces, but help me do something with it.
I find it very interesting that your approach makes futures and foresight applicable, not just in the scenarios to strategy linkage, but throughout the whole process. So my question to you would be, after you found that demand, or at least according to your personal experience, you found that need to be something you wanted to work on, how did you change the program accordingly? Because when I was there in Houston, right, my thought was, oh, all right, Andy is going to do a lot of scenario to strategy exercise, I guess. But no, in reality, what I found very refreshing was that from the very beginning, since the framing, right, since the very start of the framing approach, you had the client in mind the whole time, right? And during the futuring, the baseline, and then futuring all your Houston approach, right? It was very pragmatic. So there must be, my hunches, there must be thinking behind that made you revisit the whole program. What is your thought about that?
Yeah, so maybe just a little history just to kind of back up this, where did this sort of client focus come from? So, at the time, the World Future Society was the big annual meeting, and all us young futurists would get together and we talk about all of our problems, if you will, right? And it wasn't just me, right? We're all saying the same thing, like, yeah, we got to get better at this implementation. So, it was definitely something that was going on professionally, and that's really what led to the founding of APF back in like 2002, 2003, is we said, all right, if we're going to be more helpful, we need to work on our, work on our professional credibility. So the association was one way to do that. And really the early days, it's still to some extent, but the early days when I was super involved, we were really like laser focused on how do we be more useful to our clients. But I did want to say, I wanted to define client really carefully, because we're not just saying like it's only paying corporate clients. I mean, we'd say, any futures study, to some degree, it's speaking to some audience, whether it's the public, the universe, but an audience for a presentation, like there's always someone that you're doing it for, and even if it isn't a paid client, but you're trying to produce something, you're trying to provoke or help a certain audience. And so whatever that audience is, we say, the Foresight work ought to work back from the needs of the audience and sort of deliver towards that. So, with that, now I would say that, certainly we do a lot of, not the only type of client. So like even, if you're doing, a plan to save the future of the world, you're speaking to world leaders or the public, right? So that they're clients too, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's just, this, this sense that we're doing it for someone. And so we designed a process that's doing it for someone, something.
Got it. So did the establishment of the Association of Professional Futurists help in that? Because I do know that the idea of establishing the association was just in the direction of creating a professional network, just as the word says, right? And to my understanding, that came about also because we wanted to have a distinction from the word Future Studies Federation, the Future Studies Federation, right? Because that was supposed to be more professional oriented.
Yeah, I definitely, I was in on the ground floor and all that, and it really came. So we're getting together at the World Future Society. It had a professional members forum, which the requirement for membership was you paid an extra $60 a year and you got listed in the professional directory. And we're like, well, that's just ridiculous, right? And really what we wanted was really, as sort of focused as we could be, is like, we just wanted so when you go to the General Assembly, there'd be, all kinds of people, hobbyists, and, people who are just interested in the future. We wanted just a forum where people who were, if you will, kind of making their living doing this could get together and share. I mean, it's as simple as that. And there was no real forum. I mean, that's not what, and it's not a knock on the Federation, but that's not what the Federation did or does, right? It was like, there wasn't really a good place for that. So APF was just basically a place for practitioners to get together and, network, share, exchange, and learn from one another. So it just kind of filled a need. Yeah.
Got it. So I want to touch upon another aspect of this issue, which might be seen as negative by some, and that is recently we have seen that given the increase of interest within corporation of futures and foresight practices, and the success of associations like the Association of Professional Futurists. Some more academic futures and foresight practitioners or scholars might say that we are steering from the original objectives of creating a future that is beneficial to all, right? So we are steering from the idea of civilizational foresight. So this is somehow the argument that more pragmatic futurists hear more and more, and that argument goes along the lines of you need to be careful of framing scenarios in the interest of communities, especially marginalized communities, and climate change and the betterment of the society as a whole. So we find ourselves as pragmatic futurists, right? We find ourselves in this position to defend, oftentimes, the work we do, right? So what is your position on that? How do you respond to someone who says, yes, you are a very pragmatic futurist, you respond to the needs of corporations, but how about all these problems we have all over the globe? Aren't you supposed to solve those problems? What is your response to that? Because I have been having issues with that kind of critique a lot recently.
Yeah, and really, I almost think it's the opposite sides of the same coin. I mean, so we're all motivated, I think, by or most of us at least are motivated to how do we help people in the world become a better people, better place. Like that's what we're trying to do. And I think the kind of the civilizational foresight explicitly says that's what we are doing, and that's great. And if you will, I think that kind of approach, it's kind of like we're speaking outside of the established system and saying the established system, you need to make some changes. And I think on the pragmatic end, we're in the muck. We're in that system, getting dirty, and I absolutely recognize that. I mean, that is a real thing. But I think you need to change from within and from without, and not one isn't right and one isn't wrong. I think we need both. We need people outside of the system who are, who can really, speak the hard, plain truth to that system. But there's if you're not inside the system, then a lot of people aren't listening to that. So the fact that we're in there and we are bringing good futures thinking, and while we're not pushing an agenda, we are certainly bringing a wider range of futures thinking to those folks inside the system. Now, it doesn't mean they're always going to make the right choice, but I don't see how else they're going to get that futures thinking, right? Because if they're not listening to the to the big picture, change the world stuff, then, so I think it's a perfect complement. We need people working inside. We need people working outside.
Well, I would even add to that point that you can do both at the same time. And oftentimes I hear critiques on those very corporate driven foresight practices saying, yes, but you're just looking at the corporation and just working towards the bottom line of the organization. But in reality, if you think about it, that is the same argument that you could raise for entrepreneurship, right? Oh my God, entrepreneurship is just an evil capitalistic pursuit, right? But whoever has that kind of argument will soon realize that, well, entrepreneurship is also a motor, an engine behind innovation and can solve real life problems. So the same goes with a lot of foresight practices. I believe we can do foresight within organizations that take into account the interests of outside community, ideally. All right. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just think of, like I think a lot of futurists would agree something like the circular economy is a really good idea. So you have we'll call them the external futurist, preaching the need to do circular stuff. And then, when we've worked in the last 5 years, we worked on 2 different projects where the circular economy, like one of the scenarios was basically a circular economy scenario. And then we even did a follow-up on the circular economy. And we've had other projects where we brought it up and then there's been a follow-up. So, we're exposing it's getting on the agenda. Now, it doesn't mean they're always selecting it. It doesn't mean they're always going to do it. But if nothing else, we've at least brought in some of these bigger futures ideas and put them on the table. And, we've actually had some pretty good reception to that particular one. But, it doesn't always work out happily. But, I mean, like I say, it gets these ideas on the agenda. And I think that makes me feel like we're doing a useful thing.
That's a great example. But I think you're a very rare animal in this because not everybody argues for both approaches at the same time. In fact, what I see is more like if you are in civilizational foresight, you look down on people doing corporate foresight. And so I think you are right in the middle, right? And that makes it difficult because I might think that you are criticized by both parties somehow, being in the middle. It's more difficult. But how do you see this issue that futurists, again, quote futurists, working on civilizational foresight, often do not understand the pragmatic approach of corporate foresight folks, and possibly the other way around too. How do you see this? You could also argue this is a political or ideological clash within the field, right?
Yes. Yeah, and it's having been involved in the putting together the APF. We had some of those similar kinds of debates, and there's still schools of thought. I mean, I would just say I'm in the big tent school of thought, and to me that we're even our big tent is pretty small, right? I mean, we're such a tiny little discipline.
That's true.
So to me, as is, anyone, to me, if you want to be a part of it, then come on, let's figure out a way to make it work. So I'm definitely on the big tent end of the spectrum, and I just have no problem with other points of view. So I think that's there should be a diversity of approaches and viewpoints within a field. Now, I suppose there needs to be enough glue that we feel something in common, but it doesn't. Like, all right, as an example, a good polarizing figure would be Ray Kurzweil, right? Now he's done, he's calls himself a futurist, does futures work, and it's really good work, and he predicts, and we don't do prediction, and one school of thought says, well, therefore, if you predict, you can't be a futurist, and to me, I said, let's find a way for somebody who's actually doing some good work. Now, yeah, we might have a little quarrel with how he positions it, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And to me, I think we can find a way to make that work.
I agree with that. I have a more politically incorrect question. I think that is broaching an elephant in the room. Is there a right-wing futures and foresight and a left-wing futures and foresight? And could that be Could the things we have just discussed be a reflection of that?
I mean, boy, I'd have to really. I'm not sure who would fit on the right wing. I mean, I would say as a whole, we're pretty lefty, left on the left end side of the spectrum. I mean, look, I mean, you could look at the the spiral dynamics and the different worldviews that are. And there are some, worldview differences amongst futurists, just like there are amongst the general population. No, I don't. I just think I think any field has that kind of a tension between the big picture. We'll call it the progressive and the pragmatic. That's a very common, and we just have it like everybody else does.
But what's interesting to me is that if you think about a lot of social scientists and sociology and political science, at least there is a debate on left wing and right wing, right? We do know that social constructivism is undoubtedly a left wing school of thought, and that has been permeating the social sciences to a great extent. And if you think about objectivism, which has been there for a while too, well, that is most of the time embraced by right-wing positions. So what I'm trying to say is that has not been explicit in our field. It could just be that because it's new, or because there is a wave of political correctness in the social sciences in general, that we don't want to speak too much about those issues. Right? We don't want to say that, right-wing is pragmatic, futurist, working in corporations for the interests of the corporation itself, and civilizational foresight is more left-wing. But maybe we need to have that conversation and sort of trying to see whether there are political ideologies behind our work, driving our work or not. Now, of course, you are certainly an inclusive practitioner, so it would be very difficult to label you, right? But for many others, it could be easier to be labeled.
Yeah, my experience is that if the center of gravity of the field is in the left, and I mean, it's almost. I mean, the Hudson Institute, now that's a historical one, was traditionally kind of labeled as a kind of a right-wing think tank on the future. But I mean, it's just, I don't think that's the divide. I just don't think that's there's definitely differences, but I don't think it's a left versus right thing. It's what part of the left do you want?
That's interesting. How about that? How about that? The left permeates the field. That is possibly true, but the right is silent, which is often the case in other disciplines as well. Could that be possible? Because pragmatic futurists just go on and do their things in organizations and they don't necessarily publish stuff, but those who publish stuff are more likely to be concerned about civilizational issues.
Yeah, no, it could be the crowds I hang with, but but hanging with the APF primarily, like the last 10 or 15 years, with the practitioner crowd, boy, I just don't see a lot of that, sort of crude pragmatism about like how can we make money. I mean, it's these people are their hearts are all bleeding. I mean, I don't think anyone gets into this. Well, like, if you're a smart person that wants to make money, this is not the field you get into. You get into this field because you care about the future, you care about the world. So I just don't see that sort of crude pragmatism, which I think that's like the false argument, right? Well, if you work for a corporation, that must mean you're a greedy.
That's right.
It's just silly. I mean, that's not what I see. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't exist. Now, where it might exist, and this is probably another good little issue for us to talk about, is one of the things that we've observed, and we have some data on this now, is the number of people calling themselves futurists now has gone up Well, I don't know if it's exponentially, but a lot. Like, you looked at things like you do a LinkedIn search on futurists, and it used to be, you get a couple of thousand maybe. Now it's like 14, 16,000 people. And, you just look, I do some tracking of mentions of futurists, in the media and stuff. And the number of people calling themselves futurists now is just shooting through the roof.
Well, and that is only English speaking, right? Or does that include?
Right. That's primarily, I mean, it's I sort of tracking global sources, but yeah, it's English language. But now there's an interesting lot of folks that do use the future for, go out and keynote and, give this, technology is changing really fast. And if you don't keep up, you're going to be left behind. And, and like, there's a whole industry that I think maybe an exploitive kind of keynoter industry around using the futurist title, which that has definitely kind of, that is out there, and I'm making a distinction there between, I guess you'd call it the full-time professional practitioners that I guess I'm more aware of.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So there is some exploitation out there. There is definitely some, but it's not, to my mind, it's not the people who are making a living at it.
I understand what you're saying, and I am reminded of practitioners who might just look at trends, right? Trends of the present, and the fourth industrial revolution, and then educate firms on those mega trends, so to speak, and then they call themselves futurists. So then the question becomes: do we want to include those in the big tent, and what kind of ideology do they have? Because, all right, again, right wing, left wing might be an exaggeration, but the labels are given by the opposite side, So maybe there are no extreme right wing people in the field, but those who work on civilizational foresight will certainly regard trend watchers as right wing people. You know what I'm thinking?
I do, but I just say I would let go of that left-right wing thing. I just think it's the wrong dichotomy. But if that's what people are using, let them use it. But I mean, I think that's missing it. But whatever. All right. So what I do think is in terms of this, like we'll call them the pop futurists who are using kind of using the future, right? Like I absolutely think this is a golden opportunity for us. I mean, there are 70 plus years of existence, we've labored in obscurity, and we used to not even want to identify as futurists because we'd be immediately thought of as a bunch of cranky crystal ball gazers. Now people want to identify with us, and to me that is exciting.
Amazing,
now it doesn't right? So I'd say let's spend our energy on how do we bring them into the fold? How do we take somebody who's calling themselves a futurist? Hey, by the way, we have these professional associations, we have these publications. You can come take all the various courses that are out there. There's a way that you can make your practice more grounded and credible, reliable, and so on. Like, let's try to find a way to get them in there as opposed to keep them out.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point. I'm reminded that when I was in Houston, you said that in your work, in your professional work, originally you didn't use the names and the terms to refer to futures and foresight methodologies and stuff because they just seemed too obscure, right?
Yeah.
And so that way you would be more accepted by clients, and with clients I mean organizations of different kinds. And then you also told me, but recently actually I'm starting to use the names again because they sound cool. So I was very intrigued by that.
Yeah, so I mean, I called it stealth foresight, and you basically use the tools without naming what it is. And the interesting experiment, when I went into the chemical company, we decided to not call me a futurist on purpose. And about 6 months in, they started going, "Hey, you're a futurist, aren't you?" But it was, and they was like, it was cool because by that time they had found, I guess I had passed the test and I was providing value. So that wasn't seen as a bad thing, right? That was actually seen as a good thing. And I guess now where people are identifying with futurists and with, to some degree, at least using our tools, I think we ought to be, let's just come, if you will, come out of the closet and be completely transparent about what we're doing. It actually has some cachet. And some of the newer things, using things like, causal layered analysis and the sci-fi prototyping and all the newer stuff that's emerging, people see this as cool. So for what, now we might actually be cool, so let's do it. Right. I mean, that's what I say. Like,
you didn't expect that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right. After being so careful and cautious for so long, that you kind of get into that mode, and it's like, well, that we don't have to be like that anymore. Like, people are interested in what we're doing, and so let's talk about it.
Yeah, that's very exciting. And this is something that you found with your recent research on the state of foresight. Am I right? Because you in Houston and your team has been looking at the state of foresight in North America, am I right? And you have been tracking the number of futures and so on. Can you talk about that? That is actually a very interesting research direction.
Yeah, so we want to try to make it as global as possible. But for the first round, we said, all right, we wanted to get a sense. Well, all right, we did two things. One, we just did a general LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn is U.S. centric, but it's not just U.S. But we went through and looked at jobs, futurist related jobs, and did a really pretty deep search on that. And what we found, and we haven't finished out, kind of putting all those results together, is that there are way minted jobs than we thought. Like that where there
we lost connection. Can you repeat that? We just lost connection for a couple of seconds.
Sure. I was saying that what our initial finding on the futures related jobs is there's a lot more than we thought, and a lot of them, they're just not explicitly being labeled as futurist jobs. But when you look at the job description, when you even look at some of the keywords that they're using, it's there. And some of the, they may not be necessarily pure 100% foresight jobs, but there's a huge foresight component. So what we're gonna try to like re-examine the kind of the taxonomy of our job market and say there's actually we have better prospects than we thought. And it's not just about jobs and money and stuff, but like there are openings to get inside organizations, right? And that's what we want to do. So I think there's a lot more openings than we realized before we did that research. And then that was the first point, that like, wow, there seemed to be a lot of quote hybrid foresight jobs out there that we were missing. And the second was like, all right, we want to get a sense of like what percentage of like big companies are using foresight. We started with companies. And so the easy thing to do is use the Fortune 500 because we know what they are, and they're a little bit, they're easy to access. And we found that we basically were able to, after using some methodology and using the LinkedIn database, we found that like basically 1 out of 4 U.S. Fortune 500 companies had some degree of formal foresight capability in their organization. So that, and that's a real number. Now we might have guessed that, but now we know, now we have it, right? Now we have that as a benchmark, about 1 in 4. And that, that maybe that sets a target, what should the goal be, right? If it's 1 in 4 now, where do we want to be in 20 years?
That's a great number. And is there a latent need for futures and foresight and a latent job demand of futures and foresight professionals that is labeled in a different way, or maybe they just need organizations are looking for people looking at the future, but they don't know about futures and foresight?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely it. I mean, futures thinking goes on regardless of whether futurists are there, right? And it's just a matter of how, how systematic is it? How good, if you will, in our terms, how good is it, right? I mean, so there's some planning, there's some forward thinking, but it's usually, from our point of view, we think we could bring a lot more rigor and, make it a lot more useful, but so it is going on out there. And, right now, the public perception of foresight and futures, like, number one, either they don't know about it, and number two, little, and that's our opportunity, right? Now that people are looking at us, how do we tell a good story? How do we tell a credible story? And, here's what we do, here's how we do it. And so I think that's, for me, a lot of the next 20 years is basically just maniacally repeating the story of what we do and how we do it, which is something that you're really good at.
Thank you.
By the way.
Appreciate it. I think
you're right on point.
Yeah, we need to just expand the cake. That is very important. Yeah. Get the cake bigger. So how do you go forward with this research project? Are you going to go global or what?
Yeah, I mean, we'll just see, I guess we will, kind of calibrate, how much interest there is, how much energy we have. I mean, so right now, like the second thing we're doing, and this was actually in leveraging some of the work that the Federation is doing on, they're put together an accreditation task force for universities. And so as part of that, we did a deep dive into the state of foresight in the university space globally. So now we have that data. And so that's probably the second thing that we'll roll out. And then I think the next thing we'll do is we'll take a look at government and, what's the state of foresight in government. Now we'll start in the US just because, that's where we are. And the data is a little bit easier to get to. But, hopefully over time, we can expand that to be more global.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I've been monitoring the Italian space in terms of futures and foresight, and in the last couple of years, man, the increase in people doing this kind of work has just been very surprising, positively surprising. So let's zoom in back on the Houston program in this space, right? In this positive scenario, hopefully will continue to be so. How do you position yourself? Because I do know that the Houston program now is fully online, which is it was fully online before COVID-19. We should mention that you had foresight. So how do you position yourself with a program for the next, say, 10 or 20 years, even if and when you will not be there anymore? How do you see the program evolving in the future?
All right. So one of the first thing to keep in mind is we had this, we doubled our enrollment this fall. We had the biggest semester that we've had, biggest class size that we've had in the program history. So the interest in the future, one might argue, and I've heard similar things from other academic programs in futures, that this has been a great, obviously the pandemic has spurred some interest. So, let's assume that this interest is growing and we're at the point now where we feel like we're a pretty stable, solid academic program. So you say, what are the kinds of things we need to be paying attention to? One, I think, how do we incorporate all of this sort of the big data, the scanning, the scraping, the AI, the robotics, all that quant toolkit? How do we integrate that effectively into our practice? I think that's a huge issue for the next 10 or 20 years. One that we're really paying a lot of attention to. The second thing, how do we create more positive visions for the future? right? You know, that's my after capitalism little side project. Like, you know, what are hopeful futures, right? And I think as futures, we need to get back to that work. And there's our civilizational futurists. That's what they're doing, right? And we need that, you know, helping people see a positive future, right? Because there's so much, I think, fear and negativity. So I think that the next 20 years, we really need to get back into doing more of that. And you know, in terms of the actual program, hybrid for many years, where you could come to the class or you could dial in. And then what basically happened is people just stopped coming. So we went fully virtual a couple of years ago. And I think the next step there is probably something like some sort of immersive VR environment. You know, I mean, because I think the whole gallery, you know, face of galleries thing around Zoom is probably not it. But like, you know, we could walk into a VR classroom and start to kind of virtually, physically, you know what I mean, interact again. And so we're looking at some of those platforms. No, not yet. We've had a few suggestions. I haven't seen anything yet that says, oh, this is it. But, you know, in the next 10 or 20 years, I think that's, you know, I think that the VR kind of classroom will be probably the next major wave in how we do stuff.
That'd be amazing. We'll need to think of a way to not destroy our eyes with all these VR technologies.
Yes, yes.
That's amazing.
So, you know, yeah, I mean, it's just really exciting, and you know, I'm already starting to, you know, work on, you know, and developing a succession plan, bringing in the next generation of leaders, and you know, I hope that we as futurists, you know, that we get you know, we know when it's time to turn it over and keep the field vital, right? We don't want to hang on to we're 100 years old, but turn it over and, you know, let you know, younger folks or newer folks with different ideas, and you know, let them take it where it needs to go. So I have a few ideas, but you know, I may not be the right person to say this is where we, you know, where we need to go. It's like let them take it where they want to go.
And there is so much going on just recently, new ways to look at the field, just with the design fiction school and the surge in AI, interest in using AI in futures and foresight. So there is a lot going on, and people of different fields, should not be left outside. So it's very interesting how it's going to develop in the next few years. Andy, thanks so much for this. We touched upon so many interesting points, from right wing, left wing, to pop futures, to the Houston program. So that was quite cool. So I really enjoyed this. I think your big tent inclusive sense is really useful, especially in view of a lot of division within the field. So I do appreciate you taking the time for doing this. Hopefully we'll do it again in a couple of years after COVID, and see how the Houston program has been evolving. That'd be great.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And like I said, you're doing exactly the right kind of work that needs to be done. You're getting out there, spreading the message, and we need that. I love the energy and enthusiasm you're bringing to the field. So you keep up your good work.
Thanks, Andy. That's super appreciated. You have a nice day. Take care.